Bill 66. Bob Mayer.
Hello. Yeah, I did one of these a while back, many years ago. Still pretty much the same. I titled this one, why go to the Electoral College when I was asked to come up with a title sometime before the election. Sort of anticipating that, we'd have the usual post-election discussions about the Electoral College and whether it's good or bad or anything. Well, it turned out it wasn't really an issue this time. But I did want to continue with some of the ideas that I was going to kick around in that original sort of talk. You know what the Electoral College is, right? And people talk about it, oftentimes usually to complain about it, but it's simply the mechanism by which the Constitution defines how the President of the United States is actually elected. An elector is somebody who is entrusted to cast a vote, to elect somebody, right? And so the Electoral College is the group of electors. And where do the electors come from? Well, when people vote in a state, they are actually voting not for whoever is running for office. They are voting technically for a slate of electors that is pledged to one of those people running for office. So in Vermont, the popular vote will determine where Vermont's electors, which set of Vermont electors go to the Electoral College, when it meets to cast their votes in December. All right. Now, all of this goes back to the Constitution in Article 1, I think it is, where it's talking about how these things are going to happen. And it grew out of the debates in the pre-Constitution period during the time, if you read the Federalist Papers, when Madison and Hamilton were, trying to get people to go along with the Constitution. And it was actually one of the few areas in the early discussions that didn't have much pushback. Most people were pretty happy with it, oddly enough. But it's an indirect method of electing a chief executive. That is, it's not direct like the popular vote determines who it is. There's a level of abstraction in the middle. Now, over the years, people have waxed eloquently in defense and against the Electoral College because it is possible and has happened that people can lose the popular vote but still win the presidency. And people will argue that we should get rid of the Electoral College, others that we should go to a fully popular vote. But honestly, I'm here to say basically the point I came to the conclusion of was that it doesn't matter really. The real point is not the Electoral College, because when you think about it, in the end, there's enough pros and cons and all the different ways of doing it that the technical system itself doesn't particularly play a big role in. The real question that we should be asking ourselves is why, in the year 2024, we are still basing so much of our sort of political and governmental system on 18th century ideas, particularly 18th century ideas that were created and brought to fruition in a very particular context, a context that rapidly ceased to apply well before the end of the 19th century. In that case, the Electoral College is not in and of itself good or bad, but is sort of a symptom or an example of this sort of legacy system that continues to plod along without much in the way of introspection or reflection. But that could be true of the whole structure. The main thing about the Electoral College, though, that gives us an in to this sort of discussion is something called apportionment, right? You have the concept of apportionment, which makes the mathematicians like Melanie there happy, because it is a process by which, in the political sense, we determine representation in Congress. The Senate is done. Every state gets 2 people. And you got to understand the Constitution was created with a primary function on the power of the states. The Constitution was a framework for the states to come into a union together, and the focus, though, was really on how the states would function. And so many things in the Constitution are funneled through the operations of things at the state level, all right? And we'll see this in a second, particularly, the Electoral College works that way. But apportionment. So every state gets 2 senators, but how many representatives does a state get? How many does Vermont have? 1, right? We have 2 senators, just like California, but we have 1 representative instead of something like 54, like California has, right? And why is that? Well, there's something called apportionment. That's why we have a census, right? Every 10 years they do a census, and that was mandated by the Constitution as well, because they're supposed to count how many people, and definition of people, of course, changes over time. The Constitution itself is, obviously full of things about slavery and Native Americans and stuff like that, and figuring out who counts as what. But in general, you count how many people there are that are supposed to be counted, and then you can determine how many representatives each state would get. And there are many different ways of apportioning this. The mathematical formulas, the one we've been using since the 1940s, gives every state 1 and then ranks everybody by dividing, the number of people they have. So there's like a geometric mean of the number of representatives from the last census and the ones you're already getting. And it's a complicated formula, but roughly means that states with more people get more representation. But it's not 1-to-1, because the Constitution basically says, in Article 1, Section 2 there, it says that not to exceed 1 representative per every 30,000 people. That's 1 representative for every 30,000 people. That you can't exceed that, so you couldn't have 2 or 3 for 30,000. Doesn't put any limit on how many thousands of people you can have associated with 1 representative. Today it's something like, on a nationwide level, and for the Electoral College it's the same thing, as you'll see in a second, 1 representative for every 700,000 people. If, for instance, California was to apportion itself by the original constitutional measure of 1 for 30,000, they would have 2,000 representatives or so in Congress. And this is important because the Electoral College consists of the number of electors is the Senate, 200, or the number derived from the Senate, which is 100 people, 2 for every state, plus the number of representatives from every state, plus 3 from the District of Columbia, right? So, if we had continued the way the Constitution was written, we would have a massive imperial Senate type of thing with pods that flew down and stuff, right? And so around 1911, they decided they didn't want that, and the Apportionment Act of 1911 basically effectively set a cap of 435 representatives, give or take a few over the years as they brought some states in. But essentially what that did, and it was reaffirmed in 1929 with the Apportionment Act of 1929, which firmly and legally set the maximum number of people in the Electoral College and in Congress at the 538 that we're talking about, 435 representatives and 100 senators, plus 3 from the District of Columbia for the Electoral College at least. Now you stop and think about that, even though the population continues to increase, right? We froze the number of representatives and therefore the number of people in the Electoral College. So the bigger problem is not the numbers necessarily, it's the sort of the philosophy behind it, that the creation of this manageable body of people overtook pretty much any other consideration, all right? And you ask yourself, why is that? Well, when we go back to, again, the origins of the Constitution, and we look at how the thing was put together, the polity, the number of people who were actually participating in the political process was relatively limited, and the range of opinions was relatively limited. The Constitution as a document is a very conservative document at the same time as it is very sort of liberal in the 18th century context, but only within the context of the people who actually qualified to participate. And in a system that was seen as having a limited number of people participating, all of whom pretty much agreed on the most important things, and one in which the idea of faction or party allegiances wasn't considered, the Electoral College made sense because it was people voting for individuals who then could get together in this group of individuals, Electoral College, insulated from public pressure, and then decide which amongst the elite should be in charge. Indeed, the original Electoral College, they would choose the first person who got the most votes in the Electoral College would be president, and the runner-up would be vice president, regardless of whether they even agreed on anything. As soon as the Constitution was approved and Washington becomes president, everything went to hell in a handbasket, parties emerged, and by the election of 1800, all of this had gone into the dustbin, and the flaws began to come out because the system doesn't work very well when you have these very entrenched parties and allegiances that are not based upon sort of these individuals who all being part of a common ruling class, but instead people with very different ideas. And so the real question that we should be asking us is, in the United States of 2024, with over 300 million people, with 110 million or so voting, why are we still using a system, the roots of which were based not only on 18th century political thought, but on a world that is diametrically opposed in many ways to the one of today, where the level of diversity of opinion, where the level of faction and partisanship and such was much different than it is today. And the real question you should be asking is, the system we have that reifies all political disagreement into two parties and forces everything into a contest where it's almost inevitable that nearly half the population will be bitterly dissatisfied, why are we still doing that? Because that's not the only way you can do things. There are many different ways. That worked for a limited period of time, for a limited period of group of people, because the differences weren't all that extreme and the numbers were small. But once you get to the diversity of the modern world, the sort of the binary division of our system does not hold up. It collapsed in 1860 and led to the Civil War. We rebuilt it, but we put Band-Aids on it and rebuilt the same thing again. And so now the real question you ask is not the tactical details about why did, could they have done this, could they have done that, but it's more like, why, one question is, why did 60-something million people vote the way they did? The other question is, why are we adjudicating leadership in this country in a way that leaves so many things open for controversy, for question, for uncertainty, because we haven't defined anything in a modern way. We haven't really looked at what the country needs. We're going on autopilot. And why is that? And I don't give you any answers. I'm just saying maybe it's time for us to look at the constitutional roots of these things and make some interesting decisions. Because ultimately, we also have to remember, and I'll close with this, as great as the Constitution is in many ways, it is also a bargain with the devil, because the whole thing is built on the acceptance of slavery. It is our own original sin. The entire document is framed around the existence of and the support of the institution of slavery. And when you start that way, it's not any wonder that you'll end up in a place far from the one you think you want to be in. And I'll leave you with that. Thank you.